Hello class, welcome to our second presentation in our Religion and the Environment unit. In the last presentation, we asked this question of whether the religions that we're going to be studying in this class are pro-environmental or anti-environmental. Well, our first commentator, this historian by the name of Lynn White, we're going to find is going to argue that Judaism and Christianity are anti-environmental. So in this presentation, we're going to take a look at Lynn White's critique of the Jewish and Christian traditions as anti-environmental. So first, some background. In 1967, Lynn White wrote an essay entitled "The Historical Roots of the Ecological Crisis," where he attempted to trace back the social-cultural factors that resulted in the environmental crisis of the 20th century. So in other words, he basically wanted to find out, how did we get here, right? How is it that we are facing a global environmental crisis in the modern period? So he traces back the history of it. And in his examination in the essay, Wright argued that the Judeo-Christian tradition is primarily to blame for the current exploitative attitudes toward the natural world. Why? Because the Judeo-Christian moral values are grounded in the Bible, and biblical teachings, according to White, are anti-environmental. Well, how so? Let's take a look at his argument. Well, his argument is three-pronged, so let's take a look at the first statement that he makes. First of all, he argues that the Bible has an anthropocentric worldview, or a human-centered worldview. So in the book of Genesis, Lynn White argues that human beings are created in the image of God. And what that means is that human beings are at the center of creation. And also in Genesis 1, humanity is commanded by God to subdue the natural world. And Lynn White interprets this as human beings are given the right to exploit the earth's natural resources. So the Bible teaches that there is a hierarchy in the natural world. Human beings are at the top of the food chain, as it were. So human beings are number one in the eyes of God and can basically do whatever they want with the natural world. Secondly, Lynn White argues that the Bible is anti-animistic and anti-idolatrous. So if you take a look at the Ten Commandments, for example, they warn against worshiping idols or deities made of earthly material. And the Bible in general criticizes nature worship as inferior to the true worship of God. So in his essay, White makes this statement that before Christianity became kind of the primary religion in Europe and America, there was paganism. And paganism was nature worship. So for him, paganism represents green religious traditions because they worshipped the rocks and the trees and the mountains. They viewed them as sacred. But when Judaism and Christianity come on the scene, and Christianity inherits kind of the Hebrew Bible, we find that this nature worship is condemned and discouraged. And this just kind of adds to the kind of human-centered theology that the Bible provides, and this kind of theology that nature is inferior to that which is spiritual. And thirdly, the Bible advocates reflecting upon nature so to become more aware of God. In other words, pondering nature is not good in itself. It is merely an intermediary that helps establish a closer awareness of the divine. So for example, if you read like medieval mystical literature that praises the natural world, usually what they're doing is they're praising the natural world by saying, look how beautiful this flower is, therefore let us worship God, right? Let us praise God for God's creation. So in other words, in Christianity in particular, there's this idea that you shouldn't spend too much time praising the natural world, because if you praise it too much, then you may end up worshiping it. So remember, when you admire the beauty of nature, make sure that you're always pointing it back to God. So kind of admiring nature in itself is not good. If you admire nature, that should only be for the reason of praising God for that creation. So in a nutshell, White argues that the Bible teaches us to devalue the natural world as inferior to the spiritual world, as well as encourages us to exploit natural resources for the good of humankind. And Western civilization has inherited these anti-environmental attitudes from the teachings of the Bible, and that is why we are facing an environmental crisis today. So I leave you with this question. Is Lynn White's argument convincing? That is, do Judaism and Christianity teach human beings to be hostile and exploitative toward the natural environment? So as you are taking a look at the tradition and you're taking a look at the teachings in the Bible, what do you see? Do you see green teachings? Do you see anti-green teachings? What do you think? And is the Bible to blame for the modern environmental crisis, or at least primarily to blame? So what are your thoughts on this? So not only are you going to be considering Lynn White's critique as you approach the discussion forum, but in our next presentation, we're going to look at a couple of reactions from Jewish and Christian theologians to White's critique.